The blood on Jasmine Foster's hands wasn't her own, and that terrified her more than anything else ever had in her 20 years of living in the Arizona territory. She stood at the basin in her small room above the general store in Vulture City, scrubbing desperately at the crimson stains that marked her pale skin. The water turned pink, then red, and still she scrubbed until her hands were raw. Outside her window, the desert stretched endlessly under the brutal June sun of 1883, unforgiving and harsh like everything else in this God-forsaken town. The blood belonged to Samuel Morrison, the mine foreman who had tried to collect an early payment on the debt her father owed. A debt so massive that her father had offered the only thing of value he had left, his daughter, to the one man in Vulture City who could afford to buy anything he wanted, Marcus Killian. Even thinking his name made Jasmine's stomach turn. Killian owned half the gold mines in the territory, controlled the water rights, and had the sheriff in his pocket. He was 53 years old, built like a bear, and had already buried 3 wives under mysterious circumstances. When he smiled, which was rare, it never reached his cold gray eyes. He had looked at Jasmine the way a man might examine a horse at auction, checking her teeth, commenting on her figure, discussing her breeding potential with her father as if she wasn't standing right there in the room. The wedding was set for tomorrow morning. Her father had already spent the advance money Killian had given him, drinking himself into oblivion at the saloon every night for the past 2 weeks. There would be no escape through him. Her mother had died giving birth to Jasmine's stillborn brother 5 years ago, taking with her the only softness that had ever existed in their household. Jasmine dried her hands on a threadbare towel and stared at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror above the basin. Dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders, green eyes that her mother used to say were the color of the ocean she'd never see, and a face that had brought her nothing but trouble since she'd turned 16. She had tried to be plain, tried to make herself invisible, but it hadn't mattered. Killian had seen her at Sunday service 3 months ago, and that had been the end of her freedom. A knock at her door made her jump. "Miss Foster, you decent?" She didn't recognize the voice. It was male, younger than her father's rough rasp, with a slight drawl that suggested Texas origins. "Who's asking?" "Name's Blake, young madam. I'm here about the situation with Samuel Morrison." Jasmine's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd known someone would come. Morrison had been unconscious when she'd fled, blood pouring from the gash on his head where she'd hit him with the brass candlestick. She'd hit him because he wouldn't stop, because his hands had been tearing at her dress, because he'd laughed when she'd begged him to leave her alone. She opened the door a crack, keeping the chain fastened. The man on the other side was young, perhaps 25, with sun-bleached brown hair and eyes the color of whiskey. He wore dusty riding clothes and a gun belt that sat easy on his hips like he knew how to use it. His face was honest, if such a thing could be judged by features alone, with strong bones and sun-weathered skin that spoke of long days on the trail. "Are you here to arrest me?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Blake Young shook his head slowly. "Morrison's still breathing, though he's got a headache that'll last him a month. He told Sheriff Crane what he tried to do. Crane told him he got what he deserved, and that if he bothered you again, he'd find himself in a cell." He paused, studying her with those amber eyes. "But that's not why I'm here." "Then why are you here, Mr. Young?" "Because I heard about your situation with Marcus Killian, and I'm here to offer you a choice you didn't think you had." Jasmine stared at him through the narrow opening. "I don't understand. Can I come in?" This isn't a conversation for the hallway. Every instinct told her to slam the door, to trust no man in this town, but something in his eyes made her hesitate. Perhaps it was desperation, Or perhaps it was the way he'd stood with his hands visible, making no move to force his way inside. She unfastened the chain and stepped back. Blake Young entered her small room and removed his hat, holding it respectfully in his hands. He glanced around the sparse space, taking in the narrow bed, the single chair, the trunk that held all her worldly possessions. His jaw tightened when he saw the torn dress crumpled in the corner, the dress Morrison had nearly destroyed. "Morrison should be shot," he said quietly. "He's Killian's man. No one would dare." "Yeah, I'm learning that about this town." Blake turned to face her fully. "Miss Foster, I need you to listen to what I'm about to say and really think about it before you answer. I'm offering you a way out of marrying Marcus Killian. There is no way out. My father owes him $15,000. I couldn't earn that much in 3 lifetimes." "What if the debt was paid?" Jasmine laughed bitterly. "With what? Magic beans from a fairy tale, with the money I have in the bank in Phoenix. I just sold my ranch in Texas. Got a good price for it, and I've been looking to start fresh out here in Arizona territory. I can pay off your father's debt to Killian." The room seemed to tilt. Jasmine sat down hard on her bed, staring up at this stranger who had just walked into her life with an impossible offer. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." Blake set his hat on the small table and pulled the chair around to sit facing her. "3 days ago, I rode into Vulture City looking for work. I'm good with horses, good with cattle, and I know mining operations from growing up in Nevada. I asked around, heard Killian was hiring, and went to his office. While I was waiting, I heard him talking to someone about his wedding tomorrow. About you. The things he said, Miss Foster, the things he planned to do to you to make sure you knew your place from the start, they made me sick." Jasmine's hands clenched in her lap. She could imagine what Killian had said. He'd made no secret of his views on women and their purpose. "I asked around town about you after that," Blake continued. "Found out you're a decent person caught in an impossible situation. Found out your father's a drunk who gambled away everything your mother left. Found out Killian goes through wives like other men go through horses, and nobody seems to question what happens to them. His second wife supposedly ran off with a traveling salesman," Jasmine said numbly. "His third wife died of a fever. His first wife fell down the stairs and broke her neck. All very convenient." Blake leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Miss Foster, Jasmine, I can't stand by and let you walk into that. I won't. So you'll pay my father's debt out of the goodness of your heart. Forgive me, Mr. Young, but men don't do things for free. What do you want in return?" He met her eyes steadily. "I want you to marry me instead." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Jasmine couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "You're insane." "Maybe, but it's the only way this works. If I just pay off the debt, Killian will outbid me. He wants you, and he's used to getting what he wants. The only way you're safe from him is if you're already married to someone else. He's a lot of things, but he fancies himself a gentleman. He won't touch another man's wife, not openly anyway. You're talking about marrying a complete stranger. I know, and I'm asking you to trust me when I've given you no reason to." Blake ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that spoke of frustration and something else, something that looked almost like fear. "I'm not Marcus Killian. I've never forced a woman to do anything against her will, and I'm not about to start now. You'd have your own room, your own space. I wouldn't expect anything from you that you weren't willing to give." Jasmine stood abruptly and moved to the window, staring out at the dusty street below. A few men moved between buildings, seeking shade from the scorching sun. Somewhere in this town, Marcus Killian was preparing for tomorrow, for the wedding that would seal her fate. "Why?" she asked, not turning around. "Why would you do this? Offer me protection, respect, freedom, and ask for nothing in return?" She heard Blake stand, heard his boots on the wooden floor as he moved closer but not too close. My sister was 17 when she married a man our father chose for her. Rich man, powerful man, mean as a snake. She lasted 2 years before she couldn't take it anymore. She hung herself in their barn one morning before dawn. Jasmine turned sharply, seeing the pain etched in every line of his face. Her name was Caroline, Blake continued, his voice rough. She was funny and kind and loved to sing. She used to make up songs about everything, driving our mother crazy. After she died, I swore I'd never let another woman suffer like that if I had any power to stop it. I couldn't save Caroline, but maybe I can save you. Tears burned in Jasmine's eyes. I'm sorry about your sister. So am I every day of my life. He cleared his throat. I know this is crazy. I know I'm asking you to take a huge leap of faith, but I'm offering you a choice, and that's more than you'll get with Killian. Marry me, and I promise I'll do everything in my power to make sure you're safe and happy. We can build something good, maybe, or at least something better than the alternative. Jasmine looked at this stranger with his honest eyes and his impossible offer. She thought about Killian's cold gaze, about Morrison's grabbing hands, about her father's indifference to her fate. She thought about Caroline Young singing songs in a barn before taking her own life. If I say yes, she said slowly, how would we even make this work? Killian expects to marry me at dawn tomorrow. He'll have the preacher at his house, the papers all drawn up. Then we get married tonight. Right now. There's a circuit preacher staying at the boarding house, a man named Reverend Walsh. I already talked to him. He's willing to perform the ceremony whenever we're ready. You already talked to him. You were that certain I'd say yes. No, Blake said honestly. I was that hopeful. But if you say no, I'll pay your father's debt anyway and leave town. At least then Killian will have to start courting you properly instead of treating you like purchased goods. It might give you time to figure out another escape. The offer was genuine. Jasmine could see it in his face, hear it in his voice. He would help her even if she refused him. That more than anything else made up her mind. All right, she said. I'll marry you, Blake Young, tonight. The relief that washed over his features was so profound that Jasmine almost smiled. Almost. She was too terrified to smile, too overwhelmed by the enormity of what she was about to do. We need to move fast, Blake said, his voice taking on an urgent tone. Get whatever you need from this room, just the essentials. We'll be leaving town right after the ceremony. Leaving. But the debt. I'll leave a bank draft with Reverend Walsh to give to your father tomorrow. By the time Killian realizes what's happened, we'll be long gone. Jasmine moved mechanically, pulling her trunk open and removing her mother's Bible, a few changes of clothes, the cameo brooch that was the only jewelry she owned. Everything she valued in the world fit in a single canvas bag. She changed quickly behind a screen, putting on her best dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out her eyes. It wasn't a wedding dress, but it would have to do. Blake waited by the door, giving her privacy. When she emerged, he looked at her for a long moment and then said quietly, "You look beautiful." I looked terrified. That too, but we're going to get through this, Jasmine, I promise. They slipped out of the general store through the back entrance, avoiding the main street where someone might see them and wonder where they were going. The boarding house was on the edge of town, a weathered 2-story building that had seen better days. Reverend Walsh met them at the door, a thin man in his 60s with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Miss Foster," he said warmly, "Mr. Young told me of your situation. I want you to know that I believe marriage should be entered into freely, and I'm glad to help you avoid a union that would bring you nothing but sorrow." "Thank you, Reverend." They followed him into a small parlor where the last light of the setting sun streamed through lace curtains. It was nothing like the grand wedding Killian had planned, with half the town as witnesses and a feast afterward. It was just the three of them, plus the boarding house owner's wife who would serve as a witness, in a quiet room far from prying eyes. Reverend Walsh opened his Bible and began to speak the words that would bind her to this stranger forever. Jasmine's hands trembled as Blake took them in his own, his grip warm and steady. He spoke his vows clearly, his voice never wavering, promising to honor and protect her for all the days of his life. When it was her turn, Jasmine's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. I, Jasmine Foster, take you, Blake Young, to be my husband. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Blake produced a simple gold band from his pocket and slipped it onto her finger. It was slightly too large, but Jasmine closed her fist around it, holding it in place. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife, Reverend Walsh said with a smile. You may kiss your bride. Blake looked at Jasmine, a question in his eyes. She gave the smallest nod and he leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. His lips brushed hers so gently it was barely a kiss at all, more of a promise, and then he stepped back. We need to go, he said softly. My horse is ready and I've got supplies for the road. Reverend Walsh handed Blake a document. Your marriage certificate. Guard it well. And here's a second copy for my records. I'll file it with the territorial office in Phoenix next week. Thank you, Reverend, for everything. Blake handed him an envelope. This is for Mr. Foster. Make sure he gets it tomorrow morning after dawn, not before. I understand, son. God bless you both. They left through the back door again, moving through the deepening twilight. Blake's horse was tied behind the stable, a strong bay gelding with a white star on its forehead. Next to it was a smaller mare already saddled. She's yours, Blake said. Figured you'd want your own mount. Jasmine ran a hand along the mare's neck, fighting back tears. She'd never owned a horse in her life. Thank you. We've got about 30 miles to cover before we can rest. I know a place, an old mining camp that's been abandoned. We'll be safe there for the night, and then we'll head north toward Prescott. I've got friends there who can help us get settled. They mounted up and rode out of Vulture City as the first stars appeared in the vast Arizona sky. Jasmine didn't look back. There was nothing in that town worth remembering, nothing but pain and fear and a future that would have destroyed her. Blake set a steady pace, not pushing the horses too hard but keeping them moving at a good clip. The desert at night was a different world, cooler and mysterious, full of shadows and distant sounds. Coyotes called to each other across the emptiness, and somewhere an owl hooted its haunting question. They rode in silence for the first hour, both lost in their own thoughts. Jasmine kept touching the ring on her finger, testing its reality. She was married, to a stranger who had saved her from a monster who asked for nothing but the chance to keep her safe. Are you all right? Blake asked finally, slowing his horse so they rode side by side. I don't know what I am, Jasmine answered honestly. Grateful, terrified, confused, all of it at once. That seems reasonable given the circumstances. Can I ask you something? Anything? Do you regret it already, spending all that money, tying yourself to someone you don't know? Blake was quiet for a moment, his face shadowed in the starlight. I don't regret it. I won't regret it. I meant what I said back in your room, Jasmine. I've got more money than I need, and it's better spent on saving a life than sitting in a bank. As for being tied to you, well, I've seen how you handle yourself. You survived in that town with dignity and courage. That's worth more than gold. I hit a man with a candlestick. A man who was trying to assault you. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's survival. Jasmine felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. "Your sister, Caroline, what was she like?" Blake smiled, a sad but genuine expression. "She was 3 years younger than me, always getting into trouble. She couldn't resist a dare, couldn't walk past a tree without trying to climb it. Drove our mother to distraction. When she got older, she got quieter, more careful. Our father said she was maturing, becoming a lady. Looking back, I think she was just learning to hide who she really was to avoid his disapproval. And then he married her off. To a man who promised to make our father's business ventures more profitable. Caroline tried to tell him she didn't want to go, that there was something wrong with James Patterson. Our father wouldn't listen, said she was being hysterical, that all brides got nervous." Blake's hands tightened on the reins. "After she died, I found her diary. 2 years of hell documented in her own hand. Patterson beat her, controlled every aspect of her life, told her she was worthless and stupid and lucky he'd married her at all. She believed him eventually. That's what kills me. She actually believed she deserved it. I'm so sorry, Blake. After the funeral, I told my father exactly what kind of man he'd sold Caroline to. We haven't spoken since. I sold my stake in the family ranch, took my inheritance early, and moved to Texas to start over. Did well there, but the memories followed me. So I decided to try Arizona territory. And then I rode into Vulture City and heard Killian talking about you, and it was like Caroline was giving me a second chance." Jasmine understood now. She wasn't just a woman he'd saved. She was his redemption, his way of making peace with the sister he'd lost. It should have felt like pressure, like an impossible burden, but somehow it didn't. Somehow it felt like they were helping each other. They rode on through the night, stopping occasionally to rest the horses and drink from their canteens. Blake pointed out constellations, telling her stories his mother had told him about the stars. Jasmine found herself relaxing degree by degree, letting the rhythm of the horse's gait and the vastness of the desert sky calm her racing thoughts. It was nearly midnight when they reached the abandoned mining camp. It was little more than a few collapsed buildings and a mine shaft sealed with a wooden frame, but there was a small structure with most of its roof still intact. Blake helped Jasmine dismount, and she realized how sore she was from the long ride. "I'll get a fire going and see to the horses," Blake said. "There's blankets and food in my saddlebags. Make yourself comfortable." The interior of the structure was dusty but dry, with enough space for them both to sleep separately. Jasmine spread out blankets while Blake worked outside, and when he came in carrying his saddlebags and rifle, she'd made the space as comfortable as possible given the circumstances. He built a small fire in the old stone hearth, and they ate hardtack and dried beef in companionable silence. The exhaustion was catching up to Jasmine now, making her movements slow and clumsy. "You should sleep," Blake said. "I'll take first watch." "Watch? Are we in danger?" "Probably not, but I'd rather be cautious. Killian might send men after us once he realizes what happened." The reminder sent a chill through Jasmine. "Will he come himself?" "I doubt it. Men like Killian don't do their own dirty work. But his men are loyal because he pays well, and they'll be motivated to bring you back." Blake must have seen the fear in her face because he added quickly, "But they don't know where we went, and we've got a good head start. We'll reach Prescott in 3 days if we push hard. Once we're there, we'll be under the protection of the territorial marshal. He's a friend of mine, a good man. Killian's influence doesn't reach that far north." Jasmine nodded and lay down on her makeshift bed, wrapping herself in the blanket. She could see Blake silhouetted against the fire, his rifle across his knees, watching the darkness beyond the doorway. She should have been too afraid to sleep, too keyed up by everything that had happened, but her body had other ideas. Within minutes, she drifted off. She woke once in the deepest part of night and saw that Blake had switched positions, now sitting with his back against the wall where he could watch both the door and the window. His eyes were closed, but she could tell he wasn't deeply asleep, just resting, guarding her even in exhaustion. Something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in her chest, something that felt almost like trust. When dawn came, they were already riding. Blake had woken her before first light, and they'd packed up quickly, eating cold biscuits as they rode. The desert was spectacular in the early morning, all gold and purple and red, but Jasmine barely saw it. She kept looking over her shoulder, expecting to see riders pursuing them. "They're not coming," Blake said, noticing her glances. "Not yet anyway. Reverend Walsh won't give your father that envelope until full dawn, which was the time you were supposed to marry Killian. Your father will have to take it to Killian. Killian will have to verify the bank draft is real, and then he'll have to decide what to do. We've got hours on them at least." "You've thought this through." "I've thought of little else since I heard about you 3 days ago." 3 days. He'd known about her situation for 3 days and had managed to plan an escape, secure a preacher, buy a horse for her, and arrange everything else. Jasmine couldn't decide if that was impressive or terrifying. They stopped briefly at midday to water the horses at a small creek that cut through the desert landscape. Blake filled their canteens while Jasmine stretched her aching legs. She wasn't used to so much riding, and every muscle in her body protested. "We'll take it easier this afternoon," Blake said, reading her discomfort. "There's a town about 15 miles north called Wickenburg. We can stop there for the night, get you a hot meal and a real bed." "Is that safe?" "Won't someone recognize us? Wickenburg's big enough that strangers don't stand out, and it's not under Killian's control. We should be fine for one night." They reached Wickenburg as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. It was bigger than Vulture City, more established with a proper hotel and several saloons. Blake secured them a room at the hotel, and Jasmine noticed he asked for 2 rooms without hesitation, then frowned when the clerk said only one was available. "It's got 2 beds," the clerk said helpfully. "Missionaries stayed there last week, a married couple. They didn't complain." Blake looked at Jasmine questioningly. She nodded slightly. They couldn't afford to draw attention by making a fuss, and besides, she trusted him. That was still strange to realize, but it was true. The room was clean and simple, with 2 narrow beds separated by a small table. Jasmine sank onto one of them gratefully, while Blake went to arrange for baths to be brought up. When he returned, he had a package wrapped in brown paper. "I asked the hotel owner's wife if she had a dress to spare," he said, setting the package on Jasmine's bed. "Figured you might want something that wasn't covered in trail dust." Jasmine opened the package to find a simple green dress, practical but pretty, along with fresh undergarments. Tears stung her eyes again. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to. You deserve nice things, Jasmine." The baths arrived shortly after, and Blake took his turn first, then stepped out into the hallway to give Jasmine complete privacy. She sank into the warm water with a sigh of pure relief, scrubbing away days of fear and dirt, and the phantom feeling of Morrison's hands on her skin. When she emerged, clean and dressed in the new green dress, she felt almost human again. Blake had arranged for dinner to be brought to their room, another kindness that made Jasmine's throat tight. They ate real food, hot stew and fresh bread and apple pie for dessert, sitting across from each other at the small table. "This is the best meal I've had in years," Jasmine said, savoring every bite. "Better than what you would have had at Killian's wedding feast. Much better. This meal comes with freedom." Blake smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his face. "To freedom, then." They talked as they ate, cautiously at first and then with growing ease. Blake told her about his ranch in Texas, about the horses he'd raised and the life he'd built there. Jasmine told him about her mother, about the small moments of joy she'd managed to carve out in Vulture City, despite everything. They carefully avoided talking about the future, about what their strange marriage would look like once they reached Prescott. When dinner was done, Blake excused himself to check on the horses one last time. Jasmine prepared for bed, braiding her damp hair and climbing under the covers of her narrow bed. She was nearly asleep when Blake returned, moving quietly through the room. "Jasmine," he said softly. "MMM. Thank you for trusting me. I know it wasn't an easy choice. Thank you for giving me a choice at all." She heard him settle into his own bed, the ropes creaking under his weight. The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of the town settling in for the night. Jasmine stared at the ceiling, thinking about how much her life had changed in 24 hours. Yesterday morning, she'd been preparing to marry a monster. Tonight she was sharing a room with her husband, a man who treated her with respect and kindness, who asked for nothing but the chance to keep her safe. "Blake," she whispered. "Yeah, I'm glad it was you. I'm glad you were the one who came." There was a long pause, and then his voice came through the darkness, warm and sincere. "So am I, Jasmine. So am I." They reached Prescott on the third day, as Blake had predicted. Jasmine was saddle-sore and exhausted, but the town rising out of the pines was a welcome sight. Prescott was the territorial capital, bigger and more civilized than anything Jasmine had seen before, with proper streets and brick buildings and people everywhere. Blake led them straight to the marshal's office, a solid structure near the town square. The marshal, a man named Thomas Brady, looked up from his desk as they entered, and his weathered face broke into a grin. "Blake Young, you son of a gun. I heard you'd sold out in Texas. What brings you to Prescott?" Then his eyes landed on Jasmine, and his expression grew curious. "Tom, this is my wife, Jasmine. We need your help." Over the next hour, Blake explained everything that had happened in Vulture City. Marshal Brady listened intently, his expression growing darker as the story unfolded. When Blake finished, the marshal sat back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "Marcus Killian. I've heard stories about that man, none of them good. You two did the right thing getting out of there." He looked at Jasmine with sympathy. "You're safe here, Mrs. Young. Killian has no authority in Prescott, and even if he tries to make trouble, you're legally married. That debt was paid. He's got no claim on you." The relief that washed over Jasmine was so intense it made her dizzy. "Thank you, Marshal. Thank Blake. He's the one who got you out." Brady stood and shook Blake's hand. "You need anything, you let me know, and I'll send word to the sheriff in Vulture City, let him know to keep an eye on Killian. Can't arrest a man for being angry, but we can make sure he knows he's being watched." They left the marshal's office as the sun was setting. Blake turned to Jasmine with a tired smile. "Ready to find a place to live? We're staying in Prescott, if that's all right with you. I was thinking about starting a horse ranch, maybe breeding and training. There's good land near here, plenty of water, and the town's growing. Could be a good opportunity." Jasmine looked around at the bustling town, at the mountains rising in the distance, at the possibility spreading out before her like the wide sky. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." They found a boarding house that would rent them a room by the week while they looked for property. This time there were 2 rooms available, and Blake took them both without hesitation. Jasmine appreciated the gesture, even as part of her wondered if separate rooms was what she really wanted anymore. She pushed the thought away. They barely knew each other. There would be time to figure out what their marriage really meant. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity. Blake found a property for sale about 5 miles outside Prescott. 200 acres of good land with a creek running through it, and an old cabin that needed work. He bought it outright with the money he'd brought from Texas, and they moved in despite the cabin's obvious need for repairs. Jasmine threw herself into making the place livable. She cleaned and scrubbed, patched holes in the walls, sewed curtains from fabric she bought in town. Blake worked from dawn to dusk, repairing the roof, fixing the porch, building a proper barn for the horses. They worked side by side, and slowly the property began to transform from a neglected homestead into something that felt like home. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains, talking about their plans for the ranch, for the future. Jasmine found herself laughing more, relaxing more, letting go of the constant fear that had defined her life in Vulture City. Blake was easy to be around, patient and kind and funny in a dry, subtle way that snuck up on her. One evening about a month after they'd arrived in Prescott, Blake came back from town with news. Ran into Marshal Brady today. He'd gotten word from Vulture City. Killian made some noise about you being stolen from him, but when Brady sent an official inquiry to the territorial governor, the whole thing fell apart. The debt was paid. You're legally married to someone else, and there's nothing Killian can do about it. Jasmine set down the shirt she'd been mending. So it's really over. He can't come after me. He could try, but he'd be breaking the law, and even Killian's not foolish enough to cross the territorial marshal. You're safe, Jasmine. Truly safe. The weight that had been pressing on her chest for months finally lifted. Jasmine stood up and walked to where Blake sat on the porch steps. Without thinking too hard about it, she wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything, for my life." Blake's hand came up to cover hers, his thumb stroking gently across her knuckles. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do. You gave up your whole life in Texas. You spent your money, you brought me here, you've worked yourself half to death fixing up this place. And you've never asked for anything in return." "That's not true," Blake said quietly. "I asked for the chance to know you, and that's been worth more than any amount of money." Jasmine felt her heart skip in her chest. Slowly, she moved around to sit beside him on the steps, their shoulders touching. The sky was ablaze with orange and pink, the air cooling as night approached. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always. These separate rooms we have. Is that because you don't want to, or because you think I don't want to?" Blake turned to look at her, his amber eyes searching her face. "Because I don't want you to feel pressured. This marriage started in crisis, out of necessity. I wanted to give you time to decide what you really want, without feeling obligated because of a piece of paper and some vows we spoke under duress. What if I've decided? Jasmine." Her name was a breath, a question, a prayer. "I'm not Caroline," Jasmine said gently. "I'm not trapped or forced or here against my will. I chose you, Blake. Maybe I chose you out of desperation initially, but I'd choose you again now. I'd choose you 100 times over. You barely know me. I know that you're kind. I know that you keep your promises. I know that you make me feel safe and valued and seen in a way I've never felt before. I know that when you smile at me, my whole day gets brighter. And I know that I fall asleep every night wishing I could fall asleep beside you instead of in a room down the hall." Blake's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "I've been half in love with you since the moment you opened that door in Vulture City and looked at me like you were ready to fight the whole world. I'm fully in love with you now, watching you transform this place into a home, watching you bloom without fear hanging over you. But I needed you to be sure, Jasmine. I needed you to choose this, choose me freely." "I choose you," Jasmine said, and then she kissed him. It was nothing like the chaste brush of lips at their wedding ceremony. This was real and deep, and full of all the emotion they'd been carefully holding back. Blake's arms came around her, pulling her close, and Jasmine melted into him, into the warmth and safety and possibility of this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure? We can take this as slow as you need. I'm sure. I'm tired of being afraid, tired of holding back. I want to really be your wife, Blake, in every way." He stood and held out his hand to her. She took it, and he led her into the cabin, into the bedroom that had been his alone until now. The room was simple and clean, with a bed he'd built himself from pine and a quilt his mother had made him years ago. Blake lit the oil lamp on the bedside table, casting a warm glow over everything. They came together slowly, tenderly, with none of the urgency Jasmine might have expected. Blake treated her like she was precious, something to be cherished and protected, and for the first time in her life, Jasmine understood what it meant to be truly intimate with someone. Not just physically, though that was revelation enough, but emotionally, spiritually, a joining of two people who had both been broken by life and were now healing each other. Afterward, lying tangled together in the big pine bed, Jasmine felt tears slip down her cheeks. Blake noticed immediately, concern flooding his face. "Did I hurt you?" "Jasmine, I'm so sorry, I know," she interrupted, touching his face. "No, you didn't hurt me. These are happy tears. I didn't know this existed, Blake. I didn't know it could be like this. Gentle and beautiful, and something I actually wanted instead of something I dreaded." Blake pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "It'll always be like this between us. Always something you want, something we both want. That's a promise." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other, and for the first time since her mother died, Jasmine felt completely at peace. The seasons changed, summer fading into autumn and then winter. The ranch prospered under Blake's capable management. He bought a few good horses and began training them, developing a reputation for patience and skill. Jasmine discovered she had a knack for working with the animals too, gentling skittish mares and calming nervous colts. They made a good team in this as they did in everything else. Word spread about the young ranch and the quality of their horses. Buyers came from all over the territory, and Blake's careful breeding program began to pay dividends. They weren't rich, not by Killian's standards, but they were comfortable and getting more so with each passing month. Jasmine found friends in Prescott, women who welcomed her into their circle without judgment or suspicion. She joined the church, sang in the choir, helped organize socials and fundraisers. She had a life now, a real life, not just an existence of fear and survival. And she had Blake, who loved her more openly with each passing day. He brought her wildflowers from the meadow, taught her to ride like she'd been born to it, made her laugh until she cried. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, learning each other's minds as thoroughly as they'd learned each other's bodies. One morning in early spring, nearly a year after their desperate midnight wedding, Jasmine woke feeling queasy. She made it to the basin just in time, and when Blake came running at the sound of her being sick, she looked up at him with wonder in her eyes. "I think I'm pregnant." Blake's face went through a dozen emotions in as many seconds before landing on pure joy. "Really? You're sure?" "Not completely sure, but all the signs are there. I've missed my monthly twice. I'm tired all the time, and now this." She gestured at the basin. Blake whooped and picked her up, spinning her around before carefully setting her back down. "We're going to have a baby." "Jasmine, we're going to have a baby." His joy was infectious, and Jasmine found herself laughing and crying at the same time. A baby. She was going to have Blake's baby, here in this home they'd built together, safe and loved and free. It was more than she'd ever dared to dream during those dark days in Vulture City. The pregnancy progressed normally, though Jasmine was sick every morning for the first 3 months. Blake fussed over her constantly, trying to make her rest, bringing her anything she expressed the slightest desire for. She tolerated his hovering with good humor, knowing it came from love and from the memory of his sister who had died too young. "I'm not Caroline," she reminded him gently when he protested about her continuing to work in the garden. "I'm healthy and strong, and staying active is good for me and the baby. I know, I just want to take care of you. You do take care of me, every day. But you don't have to wrap me in cotton wool." They compromised, Jasmine agreeing to take on lighter tasks while Blake handled the heavy work. Marshal Brady and his wife checked in regularly, and the women of the church organized to make sure Jasmine had everything she needed for the baby's arrival. On a cold January morning in 1885, Jasmine went into labor. Blake rode like hell to fetch the midwife, a competent woman named Mrs. Chen, who had delivered half the babies in Prescott. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Blake, pacing outside the bedroom door, thought he might lose his mind with worry. But when he finally heard the thin wail of a newborn and Mrs. Chen called him in, he found Jasmine exhausted but beaming, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in the quilt his mother had made. "It's a boy," Jasmine said, her voice hoarse from hours of effort. "We have a son, Blake." Blake sat carefully on the edge of the bed, looking down at the red-faced infant in wonder. "He's perfect. You're both perfect." He touched the baby's tiny hand, and impossibly small fingers wrapped around his thumb. "What should we name him?" Jasmine had been thinking about this for months. "I'd like to name him Thomas after the marshal who helped us. Thomas Young, what do you think?" "I think it's perfect. Tom Brady will be insufferable with pride." They laughed together, tired but happy, and Blake leaned down to kiss his wife and then his son. His family. A year and a half ago, he'd been alone in Texas, haunted by his sister's ghost and his own failures. Now he had everything that mattered. Thomas grew into a sturdy, cheerful baby who smiled easily and rarely fussed. Blake was a devoted father, walking the floor with the baby at night so Jasmine could sleep, making silly faces to elicit giggles, teaching his son about horses almost before the boy could walk. Jasmine watched her husband with their son and fell even more deeply in love with him. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch continued to prosper, and they hired a young hand named Daniel to help with the work. Thomas took his first steps in the barn. His first word was horse, and he followed Blake around like a devoted shadow. When Thomas was 2, Jasmine realized she was pregnant again. This time there was no surprise, just quiet joy. Their second child, a daughter they named Caroline after Blake's sister, arrived on a beautiful spring morning in 1887. She had Blake's amber eyes and Jasmine's dark hair, and she was the most serene baby Jasmine had ever seen. "She's perfect," Blake said, tears streaming down his face as he held his daughter for the first time. "Caroline would have loved her." "She's named after someone strong," Jasmine said. "Someone who deserved better than she got. We'll make sure our Caroline knows her aunt's story, knows to value her freedom and her choices." Blake looked at his wife, at the strength and wisdom in her face, and marveled at how far they'd both come. "You're an incredible mother, an incredible woman." "I don't tell you that enough. You tell me every day in 100 different ways." They raised their children with love and laughter, teaching them to work hard and treat others with respect. Thomas grew tall like his father, with the same patience around animals and the same quiet strength. Caroline was spirited and fearless, always climbing trees and racing her pony across the meadow, reminding Blake so much of the sister he'd lost that it hurt and healed at the same time. One evening when Thomas was 7 and Caroline was 5, Blake and Jasmine sat on their porch watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. The ranch was successful beyond their early dreams, with buyers coming from as far as California to purchase their horses. The cabin had been expanded into a proper house with multiple bedrooms and a big kitchen where Jasmine loved to cook. Life was good. "You ever think about Vulture City?" Blake asked quietly. Jasmine was silent for a moment. "Sometimes. I think about what would have happened if you hadn't come along, if you hadn't been brave enough to offer me a way out. You would have found your own way. You're stronger than you know. Maybe. But I'm glad I didn't have to find out." She reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining in the familiar gesture. "I got a letter from Reverend Walsh last week. I hadn't told you yet." "What did it say?" "Marcus Killian died. Heart attack. They found him in his office at the mine." Blake absorbed this news. "How do you feel about that?" Relieved. "I know he couldn't hurt me here, that we were safe, but there was always a small part of me that was afraid. Afraid he'd find a way, afraid he'd come after our children to punish us. Now he can't. It's really over. It was over the moment you became my wife, but I understand what you mean." Blake squeezed her hand. "We built something good here, Jasmine. Something real and true and lasting. That man, his shadow, none of it can touch what we have." "No, it can't. We won, Blake. We won everything that matters." Thomas ran up to the porch, Caroline close behind him. "Ma, can we have cookies before bed?" "I suppose," Jasmine said with mock severity. "But only if you promise to brush your teeth after." The children cheered and ran inside, their laughter echoing through the house. Blake and Jasmine followed them in, closing the door on the night and the past, on everything that had tried to break them. Inside was warmth and light and family, everything they'd fought for, everything they'd chosen. Years continued to pass in contentment. Thomas turned 18 in 1903, a responsible young man who'd inherited his father's way with horses and his mother's quick mind. Caroline was 16, beautiful and spirited, with a line of would-be suitors that Blake scared off with regularity. Jasmine laughed at him, reminding him that Caroline was perfectly capable of making her own choices. "I know," Blake grumbled, "but she's my little girl. None of these boys are good enough for her." "The same way I wasn't good enough for you," Jasmine teased. "That was different. You were running from a monster. I was saving you. You were falling in love with me." "Well, yes, that too." They were in their early 40s now, with silver threading through Blake's hair and fine lines around Jasmine's eyes. They'd grown old together, grown into each other, until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. One day, Thomas came to them with a proposal. He wanted to expand the ranch, to breed cattle as well as horses. He had detailed plans, had done his research, and presented his case with the thoroughness Blake had taught him. Blake and Jasmine listened carefully and then agreed, proud of their son's ambition and good sense. Caroline, meanwhile, had fallen in love with a young teacher who'd moved to Prescott from back east. Henry was quiet and kind, with a love of books and learning that matched Caroline's own. Blake investigated him thoroughly, asking Marshall Brady, now retired but still influential, to check into the man's background. When everything came back clean, Blake grudgingly gave his blessing, though he made sure Henry understood that if he ever hurt Caroline, he'd have the entire young family to answer to. The wedding was held at the ranch on a perfect autumn day in 1904. Caroline wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, and she'd never looked more beautiful. As Blake walked his daughter down the makeshift aisle they'd set up in the meadow, he thought about how different this was from his own desperate midnight ceremony. This was joy and celebration, a union freely chosen with the blessing of family and friends. "You did good, Pa," Caroline whispered as they reached Henry. You showed me what a real man looks like, what real love looks like." Blake had to blink back tears as he placed his daughter's hand in Henry's. He looked back at Jasmine, sitting in the front row with Thomas beside her, and saw the same moisture in her eyes. They'd done this. They'd built a family, raised children who knew their own worth and made good choices. It was more than either of them had dared to hope for in those dark days in Vulture City. Thomas married 2 years later, choosing a rancher's daughter from nearby Chino Valley. Her name was Sarah, and she fit into the young family like she'd always been there. She and Jasmine became close, working together in the house and garden while Thomas and Blake continued to expand the ranch operations. The years brought grandchildren. Thomas and Sarah had 3 boys in quick succession, keeping the ranch house loud and lively. Caroline and Henry had twin daughters who inherited their mother's spirit and their father's love of learning. Blake and Jasmine reveled in their role as grandparents, telling stories and teaching skills and spoiling the children shamelessly. One evening in 1912, Blake and Jasmine celebrated their 30th anniversary. Technically, they'd been married for 29 years, but they counted from the real wedding, not the midnight ceremony. Their children threw them a party at the ranch, inviting everyone they'd known over the decades in Prescott. Marshall Brady was there, ancient now but still sharp. Reverend Walsh had passed years ago, but his successor came to offer a blessing. The house and barn overflowed with friends and family, all celebrating the love story that had started in desperation and grown into something beautiful. Late in the evening, after the guests had gone home and their children had taken the grandchildren to bed, Blake and Jasmine walked out to the meadow where they'd held Caroline's wedding. The moon was full, casting silver light over the land they'd built together. 30 years, Jasmine said softly. Can you believe it? Some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like we've always been together. You ever regret it, spending all that money, taking on a stranger's problems, tying yourself to me? Blake pulled her close, the same question she'd asked 30 years ago, the same answer he'd given then but deeper now with 3 decades of proof. Never. Not for one single second. You're the best decision I ever made, Jasmine Young. She smiled up at him, this man who had saved her and loved her and built a life with her. I love you. I've loved you since that first night when you stood guard while I slept, keeping me safe from the world. I'll love you until my last breath. And I'll love you beyond that, into whatever comes next. They kissed under the stars, 2 people who had found each other in the darkest circumstances and created light. The ranch spread out around them, testament to their hard work and dedication. Their children slept in the house, healthy and happy. Their grandchildren dreamed of future adventures. Everything they'd fought for had come to pass. Blake and Jasmine lived to see their 50th wedding anniversary in 1932, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The ranch had become one of the most successful in Arizona. Now a state rather than a territory, known throughout the Southwest for the quality of its stock. Thomas ran the operation with his sons, while Caroline's daughters had become teachers like their father, educating the next generation of Arizona children. Blake's health began to fail in his late 70s, his strong body finally showing the wear of decades of hard work. Jasmine nursed him with the same devotion he'd shown her throughout their marriage. On a spring morning in 1935, with Jasmine holding his hand and his children gathered around his bed, Blake Young closed his eyes for the last time. "Tell Caroline I'm sorry I couldn't keep my promise," he whispered to Jasmine. "I promised to save her and I failed." "You didn't fail," Jasmine said, tears streaming down her face. "You saved me. You saved our children. You saved everyone you touched with your kindness." Caroline knows that, wherever she is. Blake smiled peacefully and was gone. Jasmine lived 5 more years without him, years she spent surrounded by family and the memories of a love that had defined her life. She told her grandchildren and great-grandchildren the story of how she and Blake had met, how he'd saved her from a monster and given her a life of joy and freedom. She wanted them to understand the value of real love, of choosing each other freely, of building something good out of the ashes of despair. On a summer evening in 1940, Jasmine passed away quietly in her sleep, 60 years after that desperate night when a cowboy had knocked on her door and offered her hope. Her family laid her to rest beside Blake in the ranch cemetery, under a cottonwood tree they'd planted together their first year on the land. On her headstone, their children inscribed words Jasmine had once said to Blake on their 30th anniversary. "He saved me, and I saved him, and together we saved each other every single day." The ranch continued on through the generations, along with the story of Blake and Jasmine, a reminder that sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest futures, and that love freely given and freely received can overcome anything.